Hey there, welcome back to the channel. So today I was going to do another in my series on aliens. And in case if you haven't heard any of those, my previous episodes about that, I basically just speculate on various things about, what aliens, what they might do, their technology and other things like that. And I kind of just come at it from sort of an engineering type of angle because I'm an engineer by nature. So come on back. All right. So today I want to talk about, with respect to like aliens. So we have a lot of, there's a lot of activity and speculation whether aliens exist. And, one of the things that's kind of interesting, and this is sort of, I think, part of, one of the things where science fiction has probably done a disservice in a way, is that there's a certain tenet in, there's certain like assumption that is made generally in physics. And this assumption is that the physics like that we see, that's in our universe, is the same physics that's everywhere else, generally speaking. So that's pretty significant, right? So the thing is, if you sit there and say, oh, well, there's flying saucers, and these flying saucers are from, planets that are hundreds of light years away or something like that. Well, the first problem with that is that you have to understand that they have the same physics that we do. Now, they may have very advanced technology, but you cannot avoid the physics. So particular here, when you're talking to space travel, what is the biggest limitation and physical limitation? And that is what? The speed of light. Basically, you can't travel faster than the speed of light. And this has been something that's, been shown. It's part of, Einstein's theory of relativity, the special in general. And so this is a really, a key thing. And sort of the reason behind that is basically if you could travel faster than the speed of light. I mean, I'm not a physicist, so I go research it yourself if you want more details. But generally, it's like if you go beyond the speed of light, the mass sort of works out that you have infinite mass. And you can't really have infinite mass, right? And so this is sort of the thing is that like, well, look, we can't go faster than the speed of light. But now if aliens have the same physics, then they can't go faster than the speed of light. So now what is the consequence of that? So now, it's very interesting because people are like, oh, they're much more advanced, and they may very well be much more advanced. But no matter how advanced you are, you're still stuck with being able to travel, less than the speed of light. And so then that's got some interesting, consequences to it, because you're like, well, okay, if aliens were visiting us, then where are they coming from? It's certainly plausible that you could have aliens coming from, 30 light years away or something like that. And they're able to accelerate up to, right about the speed of light or just under the speed of light. And if this was the case, then, when you're looking at, aliens that would be visiting here, where would they, how far away would they be coming from? And, then it gets very limited, right? Because then you kind of have to think of it. It's like, well, if they can only go the speed of light, it's sort of not really realistic that they're coming from, thousands of light years away and that kind of thing. And so then what that means is that the world is a much smaller place than you think of, because just anything out there beyond 100 light years is just, it's just sort of irrelevant, right? Even for aliens, because they have the same limitation. Now, I know in like physics, there's talk of warp drives, and there's talk of, one of the things is, I think there was some theories about like, hey, maybe there's like leftover, rips or areas or wormholes in the fabric of time, in the formation of the universe, where maybe you can go faster than the speed of light because, it's a leftover area that rule doesn't apply. But generally it's like, well, I mean, these may exist, sure, maybe some physicists will figure out and find one of these and somehow show that it exists. But you know, it would be interesting. It would be a very limited thing, right? Because basically you're sitting there, you say, well, if you want to go exactly where the wormhole, leftover wormhole was, then yeah, maybe you do have a faster than light. But the thing is, it's not going to be like warp 9 or warp 10. It's like maybe it's twice the speed of light. You know, it's not like oh, we have a hyper warp drive at 10 times the speed of light, or 20 or 100 or 1,000 times the speed of light. So it's really interesting about that when you look at like Star Trek and like warp drive, warp 10, like, okay, that's only 10 times the speed of light. You know, so, you know, if you're talking about something that's 10 light years away, you're still going to be traveling for a light year. So this is kind of, you know, an interesting thing, because it's that distance is like, aliens are facing this problem too, not just us. I mean, we have this problem where it's like, okay, if we're going to go and send people to Mars, you know, you got to get the trajectories right, all that stuff. You got to figure out how to do it. And it's just going to take a long time. It's a long time in space, and space is risky. And then you have all the social things of dealing with the fact that you have to spend months, you know, maybe like a year with people in space, in very confined spaces. Well, what's interesting about it is aliens have the same problem too, right? They have the same problem, you know, even if they're small. Like you listen to the Lazar guy, you know, his interviews is like, oh, they're kind of small, and the seats are very small, and okay, yeah, great. But, you know, the reality of it is that, yeah, it's going to take them a long time. And I guess, you know, in one way that might explain some things, because if you look at it and say, oh, if they're so advanced, why would their ship break down? Why would they, you know, if that was true, that there was this crash, which, you know, I don't really believe it. I don't believe like the Roswell crash, really. I mean, most likely it's just a weather balloon is most likely what it really is. But if, you know, it's interesting. So if they came like 10 years, 20 years, 30 light years away, and they've been traveling for a long time, and, you know, then they're pretty vulnerable. So they get here, if they do have a problem with their ship, no matter how advanced it is, they're kind of vulnerable. You see, interestingly, because it's almost like a one-way trip, right? It's like when you leave, and that's sort of the thing that happens here. Like if you watch that movie, The Passengers, that had, what's his name, Pratt, and what's Jennifer, whatever her name is. And they're like, yeah, they're going to like Homestead, and it's like an 80-year journey. And what they have to do is they basically put themselves in cryostasis or whatever. So they basically put themselves to sleep, basically kind of hibernate themselves. And then the story is that, oh, you know, there's something goes wrong, and the guy gets woken up, and then of course other stuff happens. He's kind of lonely, so he does stuff that kind of like like whoops. So I won't give the whole story away, but the point is, it's like, you know, it's an 88-year journey to get to Homestead 2. And you basically, in this case, you know, the model is that you have advanced cryostasis or whatever. So you can basically put people to sleep, you know, for like 100 years. And that's all good and everything. But, you know, it's like, it's interesting because if you look at that film, it's like a one-way trip. Like they all realize, you know, because of time dilation and all that, like they're giving up everything. Like anyone that they knew is going to be dead by the time they get back. And then there's this funny scene where he goes to send an email or a message, and he's like, that message is very expensive. Do you want to pay it? And the guy's like, yes, heck, I want to pay it. And he does. And it costs like $6,000 or something just to send like a small text message. And then it's like, your message should reach there in 58 years. Expect a reply in 120. And it's like, oh my gosh. He's just like, it's like pointless, right? Just totally pointless. And so that's kind of the thing. If you look at it, aliens are dealing with that same thing. So, you know, are they able to go faster than the speed of light? I mean, you know, maybe there's some way they can do it, but probably not. You know, I mean, it's hard to say, but like you have to kind of have some kind of theoretical underpinning for how you would do that, right? You know, simply just saying that they're advanced isn't really enough, right? Because they have the same physics. They're stuck with the same physics. So one of the other things, though, I was thinking about is like, it'd be kind of interesting that if you had, like, let's say you had anti-gravity, and you basically had a way to create anti-gravity, and what it would do is it just kind of like negate the effect of gravity. and in a field, right? And so this would be like you could create this anti-gravity around a spaceship. And if you could do that, that would be really interesting. So the way it works is like on Earth, we are accelerated by the gravity, the pull of our planet, and we're accelerated at 9.8 meters per second, right? And that's what holds us to the Earth. That's what gives us weight, you know, and that's what holds us here. And that's why it's so expensive to get a rocket up into the air, because you have to, overcome this force of gravity. But the interesting thing is, if you had anti-gravity, if you somehow could basically negate that, then you would instantly have, like, for example, if you were like on the ground and you were able to just get rid of gravity for your little spaceship, if you could do that, you instantly have acceleration, right? You're instantly accelerating away from the Earth at 9.8 meters per second. Because basically you're being pulled to the Earth at 9.8 meters per second due to gravity. And if you're able to overcome that force of gravity, then boom, just right away you got this huge acceleration. And then so the interesting thing would be like, okay, now if you talk about traveling between planets, it's like, okay, you could kind of see how that would work really good if you could have anti-gravity and kind of control how much gravity you're able to counteract. That would be really cool. Then you could just easily travel between the planets, right? And once again, you have the same thing. You're not going to be able to go beyond the speed of light, but you could accelerate very fast, right? Acceleration 9.8 meters per second. And if you had a way to do this, it would make travel within the planets really good. But the interesting thing about that too, though, is that if you did that, you have an interesting situation like navigation. So you can imagine that what are you doing if you had an anti-gravity and you use anti-gravity as a propulsion, right? You basically turn on your anti-gravity thing, and whatever source of gravity that is pulling on you basically gets that effect gets nullified. And so that's your acceleration, right? So now you can imagine that you're on Earth and you do this. Well, the thing is, like, let's say you're going really far, right? You're going like really far. Let's say you're going interstellar, so you're going between stars. Well, what's interesting, when you're out there between the stars, you have not a lot of sources of gravity out there. I mean, like, there's no planets around, so you don't have gravity from planets. And then the other thing that you don't have as well is, you really don't have much gravity from the sun or the stars, right? So it's kind of an interesting problem of navigation, right? Because you basically have to, as you leave the gravitational field, so let's say you're doing anti-gravity on Earth, you got to navigate really good, because, as you turn on your anti-gravity device and basically you start accelerating away from the Earth at this very rapid rate, you got to kind of get yourself on the right trajectory, because as you get like out of our solar system, right, you no longer have, like, if you don't have a gravity source that you can counter, then you're going to have trouble steering and navigating, right? That's basically how it would work. So basically you have to have get yourself right into the right trajectory, exactly where you want to go, before you leave the planet and before you leave the sun, the current sun that you're around and everything like that. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. So, but I think that's sort of the thing about science fiction movies and aliens is like, look, you gotta not getting very far if you keep this, like, ignoring the fact that we both have the same physics, and that's kind of, I think it's, so it doesn't mean that they don't exist, and it doesn't mean that they haven't visited us. It just means that it's a lot harder. It's not simple. It's not like just advanced technology magically solves all the problems. It's hard, right? It's a hard problem. And it's not only a hard problem for us, it's a hard problem for them too, So yeah, so that's kind of my babble this time about that. And so I was watching that movie. The other thing I was watching is recently this movie Idiocracy, and if you haven't watched it, you should probably watch it. I mean, it's sort of a silly movie, but it's actually really sort of deadly serious. But it's about this guy who's not the smartest guy in the world, and but he's not a dumb guy or anything, but he's just not the smartest guy, and he ends up like in some test, or he's in the military, and some test, and he ends up finding himself on Earth in the future. And it turns out that the Earth is run by, like, everyone is just gotten really dumb on the Earth, like really dumb. Like they're just like very low IQ and just stupid. So for example, one of the things they're doing is they're like basically taking Brondo, and it's like they believe their own marketing that Brondo got all this, it has all the stuff you need. So it's almost like a, it's almost like you took a commercial for like some type of a sports drink, and they applied this to everything. So they're like, oh, we're going to apply this to everything. If it's good for us, gives us electrolytes and stuff we need, then we can do this for the plants. So they're basically pouring this stuff on the plants. And of course, the plants, food isn't growing, and they're basically going to be extinct. And so they, of course, don't get it. And this is a whole bunch of other stuff there. And some of it maybe is offensive to some people, but, whatever. But, the thing is, it's kind of funny. It's like, it just seems prophetic, in some ways, because we have this social media, just the way things are. It's just the lowest common denominator. Everything is the lowest common denominator. So it's like you're just like, what gets the most views on social media? Pretty much the dumbest stuff, right? And the silliest stuff. And you just kind of wonder if that's the direction the world is going in, not just the US, but the world. This sort of seems that way sometimes. So back to the aliens. So if the aliens, see, it would be good if they had anti-gravity, because that would be good for like interstellar and traveling around solar systems. But in real deep space, if you're far enough away, like think about it, if you're like far enough away from any galaxy, if you're out between stars and you're out between galaxy, there's no gravity out there. There's very little gravity. So then you have a big problem, because you can't really control yourself. You can't really accelerate your stuff, so it's kind of like, it's kind of interesting. Are the aliens out there that get lost out there, but it is kind of interesting, because one of the things that happens, like, like on the engineering side of things, like the way engineering sort of works is we don't totally understand stuff. We tend to just like, they'll teach us enough and we'll learn a bunch of math and we'll kind of get an idea how something works. But it's the way things work is like, you have a certain amount of understanding, but it's not a complete understanding. And there's like, the rocket scientists, physicists, have a deeper understanding of a lot of these things. Like, for example, like device physics. It's like, okay, I can, go through basics of device physics, and everything I do relies on device physics. But, it's a totally different thing to be like, designing the physics of a modern process library, or really understanding how all that stuff works. It's like a totally different level of understanding. And so, so that's kind of how it works. So I don't know if, what the aliens would do, if they have this figured out or not. But, it's just kind of interesting, because why? I guess the question is, do you think we're at the point where like we could actually like publicly acknowledge that, yeah, there's aliens here visiting us, and without the world freaking out? It's kind of funny too, because I guess I'll talk about this one too. But it's funny how people think like, oh, if we admit there's aliens, then all this. It's so funny. Like all the atheists come out, and they kind of come out like out of the woodworks. It's like, oh, that would mean God doesn't exist. I'm like, okay, really? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. But it's like so funny. It's like this huge thing that's overplayed in terms of like all the consequences of that. The reality is that. If you realize there's like aliens and it becomes public, nothing really changes. At this point, does anything really change? Okay, yeah, we have aliens there. Like, did you really think there weren't going to be some? My thought on it is that it tends to be that, I don't even know if they've ever visited us, because I think what's happening, and I think what's underplayed, is that we are really rare. this planet is really rare. You have to have liquid water. You have to have things just right. I mean, think about it. You have to be in the habitable zone. And they're like, oh, we found all these planets in the habitable zone. Okay, great. But you also have to have a star that's the right size, right age. Then you also have to have a magnetic field or something, because like if we didn't have our magnetic field, I mean, we would just the sun would just scour the earth, right? We wouldn't even have an atmosphere anymore. So when you look at the things that a planet needs to survive, to basically support life, it's just incredible. You need all this stuff. You need all these things to be perfectly right. So so one thing that I think is very plausible is that it's like, hey, there could be life out there, but it's very plausible that, they have no way of getting to us and we have no way of getting to them. I mean, if they're out there hundreds of light years away, they have no practical way to get to us, right? Because they have the same physics problem. It's the speed limit of light. They have the same thing. And then, imagine if, you did find a wormhole left over from the formation of the universe and you're like, oh, we can use that and we can go, what, 2 times the speed of light, 3 times? It's like, okay, it doesn't work, right? So I think that's kind of, that's the reality of it, So I think it's kind of, I think it's very possible that, in effect, they don't exist, right? Because and I don't know why the scientists, like, they get all worked up about it. They have to, so many people just like have to believe in it. It's almost like, that movie Contact, where she's very atheistic, but then she's very like, kind of religious in her beliefs, and it's, it's kind of like, it's kind of fine. I think it's probably just a much harder problem, but it's interesting because those videos of the stuff, these videos, I think the Navy pilots and the Tic Tac and these other guys, these are pretty like messed uply advanced stuff. So I don't know how that works without, but see, you can imagine that, if you, if you had an anti-gravity device, and a device that's got this can make a tear-shaped field that would counter gravity, and that would, you can imagine how that could work, right? If you can control, it's just steering. You basically have this force of gravity pushing, and if you can control how you counter that with your anti-gravity device, you basically are controlling everything. So I don't know. Those are pretty interesting. Now, would they be like something made by us? I mean, maybe, but probably not. It's kind of interesting too, because that like if you look at that and it is anti-gravity, then it's kind of interesting. There's certain consequences to that where it's like, hey, they don't have drag. That's kind of the thing. So if you go and you say anti-gravity and somehow you're able to, basically have a device that you can turn on, it counters the effect of gravity, so that basically you get this acceleration, almost instant acceleration at whatever the pull of the gravity source is. So for us, it'd be 9.8 meters per second. And if that happens, it's a pretty powerful propulsion source. But and then you can, that as part of that, see, because when you pull the gravity away, what you're actually doing, as well is, there's no atmosphere there. And that's the other thing, right? There's no atmosphere because, our atmosphere, what is the atmosphere? Well, our atmosphere is like, well, we don't think about it. We don't think about, the atmosphere like weighs something, but it does. It's atoms of different material and it weighs, it has a weight. And matter of fact, that's one of the things that they study in terms of the minimum, sort of like a minimum size of a planet to be able to sustain an atmosphere, right? Because if that planet is not big enough with enough gravity, then it cannot, keep that atmosphere. If an atmosphere does form, can't keep it around. It'll just, evaporate and dissipate out into space. So if you have anti-gravity, what's interesting about that is that, well, you don't have aerodynamics. There's no aerodynamics because there's no air. So aerodynamics is like the study, it's basically a fluid, and the fluid is air. It's similar. You could study, fluid dynamics. I mean, I'm assuming they're different. You know, they have the different specialties in terms of, because of the way, you know, fluids are so much thicker than air. But at the end of the day, it's like a fluid dynamic type of thing. And so when you pull gravity, you know, and you turn off the gravity, and basically the air right around that ship, that area where you're doing it, is like boop. That thing is like, you don't have an atmosphere. So that's kind of cool, because you can now accelerate well beyond the speed of sound very fast. Now you're limited, right? You're limited to just like, well, I can only accelerate at 9.8 meters per second. And that's an interesting calculation to figure out like how fast that acceleration really means, what that means, and the limitations of that. But yeah, and that would explain, you know, that would explain some of the fact that they, you know, the ships don't have any kind of a shape that's aerodynamic, because why would they? First of all, when they're out in space, once again, there's no air out in space. So you don't need aerodynamics. Like we don't need aerodynamics, right? For like, if you look at the ships that actually go, like even just satellites, what are satellites? They have these big, stupid solar panels out there, right? And these things aren't aerodynamic. Well, the only reason you can do that is why? Because there's no atmosphere. There is atmosphere, but there's very little atmosphere, so you don't have any drag. And so if you had anti-gravity at the same time that you're like pulling away and anti-gravitating, at the same time you're doing that, you know, you're pulling the atmosphere away, so you don't have to worry about aerodynamics. So that kind of explains, I think, you know, conceptually at least, how, you know, these supposed UFOs would be able to operate with a weird shape, because they're not working on lift, right? There's no lift, right? They don't need, like, we need a wing with a specific airfoil shape to get lift. And they're not doing that. They're just like removing the atmosphere. The atmosphere is just being removed. So yeah, so I think that's it for this one, my speculation. But I think once again, the key is, if you think about the alien stuff, you got to kind of figure out like, hey, they have the same physics. That's an important thing to understand, because it does, you know, and you could say that, well, no, maybe they don't. They figured out something else where they don't have the same physics. And it's like, well, no, because like you look at all the science, like you look at like how we kind of get an idea about the composition of the stars in different places, and all this stuff. And a lot of that stuff is all basic physics that you can do in a lab. Like you can do a lab and check the emission spectrum of, you know, of different elements and all that. And that's what they're looking at when they look at planets and at stars to figure out like what they're made of, right? And so if all that isn't right, I mean, it's possible, but if that isn't right, then pretty much all the physics, including, you know, relativity, are in the trash bin, right? All that stuff's gone if that basic tenet that we have the same physics doesn't apply. So, you know, yeah. So I don't think that's the case. So just call me Buzzkill. All right, talk to you guys later. Bye.